The fact is that I've rarely had a good experience with a horror anthology. There are outliers, such as the Creepshow franchise and Hammer House of Horror, the content of which lays in that odd territory of, I know this movie sucks on every single level of its production, and it's probably problematic nowadays on top of that, but boy do I love it anyways. As well as Channel Zero, which is actually good and made me sniffle once or twice. Any other anthologies, and trust me, I've tried to give them a chance, have truly not been welcome in my swamp, especially after I watched Holidays on Netflix back when it came out. Something about the inanity and poor overall quality of that one was so profoundly touching that I swore off an entire genre for years. I think it might have traumatized me, so really those directors owe me money now, but I won't wait on them to start healing me. I've decided it's time to try again with Beyond the Dark, a 2022 horror anthology series released on April Fool's Day. Hopefully I'm not getting joshed by all these positive reviews though. Since it is organized into episodes, I decided to not watch every entry simply because some do not interest me at all and it's not like I'm getting paid for this, so I can do what I want. That'd be an excellent ad segue, but for some reason my generally hateful disposition and niche micro internet celebrity status doesn't really attract that many sponsors. Anyways, it's an anthology produced by the Horror Collective. Its synopsis describes its thesis as everything ends. Your marriage, your life, your civilization, the earth, and the universe as we know it. Say goodbye to everything you know, and hello to madness and unexpected horrors. So let's delve into those horrors, and I'll give you my thoughts on the entries I watched and how they tie into the themes of ending, beginning, and spiraling. Because the second most important part of an anthology, besides quality of individual entries, is how they tie together. Episode 2, Midnight Clear. Midnight Clear comes in at about 7 minutes, directed by Joe Russo. A father wakes his kids up on Christmas Eve, the first red flag in a series of many, to celebrate their Christmas early. His wife is clearly not having it, attempting to get her gun and save her kids, but the dad has everything planned out. They celebrate Christmas with the father using heavy-handed cheer to try and distract their kids from the fact that their mom is crying. This cheer is reserved only for them, for he knows his wife has cheated on him, and at the end it all comes together, as it would appear that the father planned to first blow up his competition's home and then his own. If this director and his fellow writer ever expanded Midnight Clear into a full movie, perhaps without the really bad fake explosions at the end, I would watch it. Yeah, the explosion is the biggest problem, honestly, because while this short does tell rather than show some information, it actually handles implying a full story very well given the little time it has to do it, to the point where I'm actually kind of impressed. From the father outright implying he has plans to kill his wife's lover, to the more subtle hint that he doesn't even know how to play his wife's favorite Christmas song by now, it's very clear that he wants her, but he doesn't love her. She tries to keep it together for the kids, but she just can't put on this outrageously happy facade like her husband can, because she's suffering in a way that he simply isn't. Even he slips up sometimes, yelling at the children and then quickly moving on as if he hadn't, although he reserves most of the aggression for her. The kids seem to love them both, so it's likely he doesn't abuse them the same way he does her. And I say abuse because, at the end, when they stand watching the explosion of her lover's house through a window, that interpretation got cemented for me. He puts on an empathetic face, and his wife immediately runs back to him, so to speak, grabbing his hand for comfort, even though all of the problems right now are his fault, and she was previously terrified of him even looking at her, let alone touching her. This is an excellent way of portraying why people stay with emotional abusers and is a critical tactic in the abuser's toolbox for keeping their victims in place. They create problems so they can solve them and increase their trust in them. I will admit that the tone is a bit exaggerated, as in the acting seems to have been directed to be almost cartoonishly simplified, but I honestly think that's the best approach to telling any story in such a short time, and it really draws out how dark the actual plot is by juxtaposing it with this kind of quirky acting style. Overall, I quite like this short, minus the very end, which again is very bad. And it's also a touch ironic that I don't like the end, because it seems to have focused on the endings theme from the anthology's thesis. I'd watch a feature-length movie of this situation, but I would really prefer something besides bombing as a method of attack in in general, because such a bombastic ending makes the rest of it seem a bit cheap and lessens the impact, but maybe that's just me. The storytelling is strongly done, the camera is handled well, and the actors are pretty good. Episode 3, Malacostraca. Malacostraca is written and directed by Charles A. Piper, and this was the short that piqued my interest the most. The cover on Shudder was nice to look at, and I really like family-based horror, so the synopsis pulled me in. And I have to admit, it took some trust to get through it, but the reward is there. Important to this short, Malacostraca is the scientific name of a class of crustaceans, aka crabs. Just think about crabs, actually. This comes into play immediately as we begin with a troubled couple on vacation. Chris is a writer, scribbling on the shore while his wife, Sophie, sleeps in the sun, disturbed only by, well, I'm not a marine biologist, so I don't know, it looks like some kind of crab to me. Chris doesn't know much about crustaceans either, because he hallucinates that the little guy, puts a little guy in his wife while he watches. We'll say it that way. That night, his wife gets pregnant. Not by the crab, but by him. But when she gives birth at home, the baby is a crustacean monster that horrifies Chris. Eventually, distraught and disgusted, he boils the thing alive. Sophie is screaming in agony at the sight, but Chris is happy to be rid of it, until it begins to cry. We understand at once that the monster he saw in place of his child was not a monster, but a figment of his imagination. You all know I feel pretty passionately about hallucinations in movies, and portraying the victim of one as a child killer is certainly a choice. I can accept that it was mostly thematic, and it does not feel intended to imply what it does, so I can forgive that oversight, but people are stupid, so I think it's important to emphasize that no, hallucinations don't equal crazy, don't equal child killer. Still, I prefer to view the hallucination as symbolic here, although they do work as genuine ones. The themes at play here are quite similar to some of those in Eraserhead by David Lynch, which I've reviewed before if you would like my thoughts on that film in depth. From the start, Chris is more envious of than in love with his wife. He has dark, intrusive thoughts, which he finally gives into throughout the course of the short, and he most certainly does not want to be a father. When Sophie is pregnant, she asks him to feel the kicking baby, and he actually pains him to walk across the room to do it, and then he merely says he doesn't feel anything. When Sophie gives birth, he is horrified at the abomination that is their child, avoiding interacting with it at all costs. He sees it as a monster until the day he kills it, dumping it in a boiling pot like the crab lobster thing he sees it as. At least to me, this entire weird monster baby thing is symbolic of how he does not view it as a real human being until it's too late. It's an abomination of a love that perhaps he isn't entirely into anymore. Sophie, on the other hand, is sunshiny. She can fall asleep anywhere, is relatively carefree, is easy to startle, and is overall rather childish. Her successful pregnancy and birth overwhelms her with joy because it's implied that they had either experienced a miscarriage or had trouble getting pregnant before the short takes place. She had been the one to suggest they go on a vacation to forget about their problems as a couple in the first place, which is a rather youthful thing to do. Sophie loves their child and sees it for what it actually is, an innocent baby. The ways these themes tie into the overarching themes within this anthology is clear and simple. Overall, this short film is okay. It comes in about 14 minutes long and the pacing is good. There isn't much information to give away to the viewer, and the one secret that the film does have, it does a good job at revealing. I went from feeling disappointed throughout the short to actually liking that aspect of the short. However, I find myself wanting context to the story that's being told here. Why is Chris not ready for fatherhood? What were they fighting about? Why does Chris hate the child? Does he hate Sophie? I have a lot of questions that I don't feel prepared to draw conclusions about based on what the short gave us. I would like a longer version that perhaps answered those questions, or a revised version. I do think the director, who also wrote the film, has the skill to do either, but for one reason or another didn't. Episode 8. The Final Girl Returns. The Final Girl Returns is about 15 minutes, directed by Alexandria Perez. This entry turns the themes of beginnings and endings on their heads by featuring one of my favorite tropes, a time loop. This loop begins because the sole survivor of a cabin massacre, referred to only as the driver, is stopped by cops who don't believe them about the horror they went through. They drive back to the cabin and end their life in a fit of grief and guilt. This guilt causes them to get stuck in a time loop where different final survivors go through through the same massacre, only to find the driver's car and get in. The first of these surviving girls is Mavis, who they pick up. The cops stop them and don't believe Mavis. They bring her home, where the killer eventually finds her and murders her anyways, starting the loop over again. This happens over and over until the driver begins collecting weapons in the back of their car and taking the girls to enact revenge on their tormentors. After they kill them, the driver takes them home, but the loop still continues on. Finally, one girl says she doesn't need anyone to save her. She gets in the car anyways and makes them tell her their story. It turns out that they have a bad case of survivor's guilt because their friend got killed as they see it instead of them. It's on this loop that the killer catches up to the car, and the driver finally faces off with him. The final girl drives off, only to get caught in the same time loop. I don't want to keep comparing these shorts to other films, but this one really reminded me of I Was a Teenage Serial Killer, which I have also reviewed, both in the heavy-handed feminist themes and the issues I have with it as a film. This short film focuses on a cycle of violence against women we see time and time again in our society. Women are hurt, authority figures don't believe them or take them seriously, and then those women get killed in a second attack by the same attacker. This sounds specific, but it is unfortunately very common, and is an issue deeply ingrained in the justice system to this day. This movie attempts to showcase that, and I think the fact that it ends with not a happy resolution but a bleak continuation is an accurate metaphor. The ending, where the final girl then gets stuck in the time loop, mimics how we force the role of saving other women on women in general, especially women who have been traumatized, and that we force them to help other traumatized women instead of taking it on our collective back as a society and actually doing something about the issue. Keen listeners might pick up on the fact that the movie does not end with any suggestion of how to solve the issue it is portraying. You think it's going to give us an answer, and then it either didn't actually mean to or just totally botches its attempt to. By not giving us a solution or any suggestion of a solution to try implementing into our own lives, it leaves the audience with a false sense of being an activist because they acknowledge sexism and not because they are actively changing their life in order to combat their internalized misogyny and the wrongs they see in the world around them. This ending that provides a solution is a crucial part of activist media like this. You have to give the audience a call to action that they can act on. You can't just leave them hopeless and lost, or the media goes from impactful to a failed cautionary tale. Like, yes, we know women get hurt. We know it's cyclical and that it's systematic. What else does this movie have to say about it other than this exists? It's not a new thing for somebody to point out after all, so what is this movie contributing to the conversation? Normally I wouldn't ask what a movie contributes to a particular conversation, but with ones like this where it's very clearly attacking a social issue, they're kind of forced to be conversation pieces. Now for the issues I have with this short. The movie works better as a metaphor than as a movie. The acting was a bit stiff and sometimes seemed phoned in. The driver was by far the strongest actor here. The writing is also somewhat weak because while the pacing and such was fine, there's a lot of questions that are left unanswered. For example, the logic of how this is all working. I know that's not the point, but I need something to help me suspend my disbelief here, and the logic in science fiction within the time loop trope is my favorite part of it. But most importantly, you have to give the audience some way to suspend their disbelief. I also think that when you turn your message into a film, you should still care about making a technically good film. The quality of the piece of media you're using to push your messages will always be positively correlated with how many people consider those messages. Overall, it does a subpar job at conveying an important message and relies mostly on that message to carry it, which just doesn't work in my opinion. It isn't the worst short I've ever seen, but it's not the greatest. Episode 10, Man in the Corner. Directed by Kelly Breslin, Man in the Corner comes in at around 9 minutes long. An article I found said it was based on a short story, which I tried to Google, but the short film just came up, so I don't know if that's true or not. If it is, that short story is definitely a creepypasta. In fact, I would be willing to bet money on it. This one just reeks of pasta, of the sauce, of the Italian. The plot is as follows. Our main guy, Daniel, goes to hook up with his dream man, but there's one issue that's making this Tinder date kind of awkward, but Daniel's really trying to overlook it. But Dave keeps trying to get in on it and he's not supposed to, and it's just... It's If You, Me, and Your Friend Steve by Garfunkel and Oates was a homoerotic short film. This ridiculous little romp comes to a head when Daniel tries to leave and faints, because he witnesses Dave putting on the skin of his lover. When he comes to, he's in bed again, sleeping next to his date. Dave is nowhere to be seen until Daniel tries to leave again and realizes the man in the bed was Dave, and the man in the corner is now his date, with the creepypasta gore to match such a creepypasta twist ending. This film is the most confusing one so far because the tone is everywhere, and honestly, after the point where Daniel faints, it kind of goes off the rails. I don't know, maybe I'm a psychopath, but the whole Dave thing was hilarious to me in the first half of this. If he added a laugh track and changed the ending, this would be an SNL skit for sure. The acting is fine. The cinematography is cool. Dave is there. If I could parse what the twist actually meant and what followed afterwards, then it would all be just peachy keen. But I haven't got a clue. I don't think media has to mean anything or symbolize anything in particular, so I could accept this as just a spooky tale, if I had any idea what the monster even was, or how it worked. The twist has such a short amount of screen time that I genuinely can't tell either. My first instinct was, oh, this is a spin on a shapeshifter. That's fun, but that idea falls apart in 2 seconds when remembering other context. If this was clearer and they focused on logic instead of spooks, then I think it would have been a lot better. As for how it ties into our beginnings and endings thesis, well, this is probably the first and last Tinder date Daniel is ever gonna go on. Episode 12, Maggie May. Maggie May is the final short I'll be discussing today. Directed by Mia K. Russell, it comes in around 13 minutes. This one is another heavy-handed social commentary that honestly probably explains itself by way of summary. It opens on a funeral for Maggie May and her sister's mother. Maggie says she didn't know what to do when her mom died, so she just didn't do anything. Her sister is staying at the house to help Maggie sort out affairs, and also because her abusive partner is waiting for her at home, and she needs time to sort that out as well, because she has 2 infants to care for and keep safe from him. Her friend leaves and says she'll call if she isn't back soon, which is a good call because she isn't going to be back soon. She trips and falls the next day, impaling herself on a coat hanger, busting her head open, and breaking her ankle while on the way to check her crying babies. And Maggie May? Well, she doesn't know what to do, so she doesn't do anything. She doesn't check on the kids. She doesn't get her sister help, even as she fades in and out of reality as she slowly bleeds out on the floor. Maggie steps over her motionless body every day instead. Finally, the friend from earlier comes in to check on her and finds her corpse and those of her babies. Maggie May says her famous line, and the short is over. I want to get this right out of the way. The effects in this are spectacular. So good, it was disgusting. The blood is realistic. Her having consciousness and being alive for so long despite numerous wounds and excruciating pain is a bit questionable, but it's all so gross, especially at the end where they show off the fantastic days-old corpse makeup they did on her, so I can excuse the inconsistencies and the inaccuracies there. It was bloody great if I do say so myself. Now the obvious thing here is Maggie May doesn't do anything. She's a passive watcher of all the bad things around her, and in the end, her inaction causes her family to die. However, I didn't detail how her sister's hallucinations as she died all revolve around feelings of inadequacy. While Maggie is content to do nothing, her sister does everything she can and yet still feels like she isn't good enough. And in the end, it's her sister that suffers unimaginably and dies, feeling like she's failed everyone. This seems to be a critique of lazy people versus overachievers, comparing 2 extremes to poke fun at one or both. Speaking of poking fun, the tone of this one is, again, a bit everywhere. The gore is breathtakingly realistic, and yet Maggie is walking around in a bad wig, and I think that explains it pretty well. It's so strange tonally, and it creates an odd atmosphere that I'm not sure how to feel about, and I don't think it really adds to any sense of eeriness like every other reviewer would probably say. It's also worth mentioning the fat phobia, but I don't know. I'll let you guys parse that one. Another thing that's worth mentioning is Maggie mentions feeling anxiety when she's speaking into her phone at one point, but I don't think this is anything to do with mental health, even though sometimes depression and such can certainly feel like you are Maggie May. With the juxtaposition with her sister, I just don't think that reading of it makes all that much sense, and it would also be a little bit offensive, to be honest, so I'm just gonna give them the benefit of the doubt with that. Overall, not my favorite, and now my tummy hurts. As for how it ties into the overarching themes, this one seems the most loosely connected to them out of the 5 shorts I watched, and that was the last short of the bunch. Is my horror anthology aversion cured? Maybe. I actually enjoyed most of these, and even when I didn't, they were all competently done and weren't the same type of horrible that I'm just plain used to finding in these collections, so I'm pleasantly surprised, if nothing else. I'd recommend this series even. Let me know your own thoughts on the series if you've watched it, if I should check out any of the other shorts and all that jazz. There are 13, and while I only watched these 5, I might consider watching the other ones too. Since these are all such short flicks, I try not to use a lot of moving B-roll so I could respect copyright better. Hopefully it won't be an issue when I'm uploading this one, but we'll see. You might just see static images in the background, and if that's the case, I'm sorry, I tried my best. If you'd like to support this channel monetarily, my Etsy, Depop, or Redbubble stores are great ways to do that. And if you can't or don't want to, liking and subscribing are free ways to support me that do a lot. Thanks for watching. I didn't know how to end this video, so I didn't write a sign off.